Y'all ready for this? Yeah. Hey guys. Welcome back. I really hope you're watching these, cause like if not, what am I even doing? um, I got some Cosby Show and Fresh Prince to talk about today. Um, so I'm gonna get right into it. So the Cosby Show that you watched, the pilot episode, it kind of sucks that you guys haven't seen the show. Like, it was such a huge show. Um, it changed television, really. It was such a huge show in its time. Number one in the ratings, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't just black audiences that loved it. Everybody did. Sadly, and Cosby was like America's dad, which is unfortunate in hindsight after all the shit he's done. Um, but the show itself is very different from the pilot. So you guys watched the pilot and had some good comments about it. What I need to start with is the changes that they made between the pilot and the first aired episode. And the choices that they made in that process that really makes this show about class, not race. That makes any sense? A lot of people like to conflate those two ideas, race and class, into the same category. That's not really, I mean, they're not the same thing. They're very closely related, but in the Cosby Show, there's a bunch of things that are in the pilot that they changed for the rest of the series. And you guys kind of touched on a couple of them, but 10, maybe not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, people knew the Cosby Show enough that they would be able to pick out the differences. Anyway, one difference is they have 4 kids in this episode pilot. The rest of the series they have 5. They added an older daughter, Sandra, who is at Princeton. So why add this kid? My theory is it's to illustrate that this sort of revolutionary, Huxtable uh, uh, plan of getting your kids a good education and sort of being firm with them and all those kinds of things, demanding a certain standard from your kids yields this, right? She's the end product. She's what happens through the Huxtable process, the family process of, their values, their education, all those kinds of things. If you follow this pattern, this is what you end up with. So that's one. Another one is the townhouse that they live in, right? It's like a brownstone in Brooklyn, I think, technically. Um, and the they made it more lavish, I guess. That's a bad word. But that house in the pilot, they made considerable, they made it bigger, they made it more fancy, I guess. Um, they made it just them look more affluent, like they had more money. Uh, and that was another change that was pretty noticeable. If you've seen any other episodes of the show, you're like, oh, this is a different house. And again, that's to focus on the class aspect of it. Um, they also, shoot, what were the other ones? Um, Claire, the mother, like she's a pivotal character in this, and how do they? All these decisions are toward making the kind of points that they want to make, if that makes any sense. So a bunch of you commented on Claire's role in the pilot, that she's kind of a stay-at-home mom. She's technically not. I think they mention in like a throwaway line that she is a lawyer, but you're right. Her depiction in that first episode, the pilot, is like she's kind of this fiery Latina mom. She's speaking Spanglish, and she's got the apron on the whole episode, and wait till your father gets home. Like that's all old traditional ways of thinking about family. So they were like, they made a couple adjustments. They took Claire. She's still the mother, but the who talked about balance? Jeff talked about balance. They made her an equal partner with Cliff in the series, in that she had as much power, right? She did disciplining. Like it wasn't like this pilot episode. They gave her. She'd wear these quite infamous, like huge, like power suits, right? They focused more on her as a lawyer, right? She was at the office more. She wasn't just bound by the home. So they had to make, that was another choice they had to make. It was like, let's make her this kind of mother, which was kind of a new thing. And the 80s was, I mean, that was the gender boom that was going on. Was tons of women were going back to work, right? Pretty much every big sitcom in the 80s had a mother that had some big time job in addition to being a mother. So her role changed, and I think these changes were made to put an emphasis on this class distinction, or make it about class, if that makes any sense. So those are a few things that you couldn't tell because if you haven't seen the second, the rest of the series. So basically, the criticism of the Cosby Show when it came out was, hey, you can't just make a black family white, which is like, I mean, how racist is that just in general? But it's racist, but it's not necessarily false. Like people think that success and wealth and education are exclusively white attributes when they're, I mean, they're not, obviously, but in the 80s, that was this prevailing stereotype, that any that if you had money or education, like that the black community didn't have those things basically, and if you did, you sold drugs, or I mean, again, these are base, like disgusting stereotypes. Just saying, like, here comes Cosby with this show about this family, where the father is involved. They are a doctor and a lawyer. Their kids go to Princeton. They live in this huge, you know, house in Brooklyn. Like, all that stuff was new, and sort of groundbreaking. And they were challenging this idea that those things I mentioned before, wealth, education, whatever, family values, were not exclusively white, if that makes any sense. So that was the big criticism of the show. was like, you can't just make a black family white. Like, what does that solve? Well, people making that claim really weren't watching the show, basically, um, and didn't know anything about representation. A couple of you mentioned it. Um, Shay talked about representation, and Alyssa about the positive representation of this family. Like, just having me being a white male, it's like all I've had sort of spit back at me from TV and movies is white men. Like, I see myself, I can't not see myself, right, represented in the media. Not the case for people of color and other marginalized communities. So that can be just sort of, um, that can disillusion you to the success of a culture, as if you don't, yeah, like, where's me, right? So this was the first time on TV, at least, that a black kid or whoever is like, oh my God, that's me. Like, and it wasn't, just a representation of a gangbanger or an athlete or a musician or whatever, like those stereotypes. Um, it was it was holding the community to a higher standard, basically, and basically saying this is all achievable if you sort of do these things, right? You um, keep your family together, you stress education, you stress values, you stress doing the right thing, whatever. Um, so it's easy to miss that. No, you know what? It's not easy to miss that. Like, the whole scene with Theo and Cliff in his room with the Monopoly money and regular people, and like, he just wants to be, you're a doctor, mom's a lawyer. Well, what if I just want to be a bus driver or whatever? That whole thing is, it's not even a loosely veiled metaphor for all these sort of criticisms that this is the pilot episode. Like, Cosby knew what people were going to say, and he addressed it in that scene. That scene is like, no, we've been convinced as a community, the black community, we've been convinced by the media and stereotypes and the culture that all we can ever be is bus drivers and like is like this, low bar. And that's, you know, this show itself is trying to show you another way. There is another thing you can be. So we've bought into it. Again, the community is bought into those stereotypes to its own demise, basically. Right? So the whole discussion between Cliff, right, Theo wanting to be regular people is Cliff addressing the concerns of the quote unquote concerns of the African American community, which is what everybody said the show doesn't do. Just because, again, it didn't focus on drugs and, all the shitty stereotypes. It actually did focus on the community, probably more than any other, but in raising it up and giving a different perception was the way to do that, right? They had countless guest stars come on the show, prominent black figures, politicians, musicians, artists, activists come on the show in different roles. They featured African art and artifacts through the house. They showed a true connection to their culture just without, beating people over the head with it, right? And again, looking at the positive sides uh, of the culture. Um, So the whole, I go back to it all the time. That scene in the middle with Cliff and Theo in the room and the Monopoly money is literally saying to those to that community, to those critics, here is how I'm going to address the concerns of the African American community. And these are the primary concerns, is like settling for less than that of which we are capable, right? Assuming that the system is rigged against us, right? Um, just wanting to be regular people. Well, you've already lost. Now, that Cliff makes that point. If you're going to try your hardest, if you end up being a bus driver, okay. Like, that's not the point. The point is to try to be um, try to exceed or or sort of topple the stereotypes. Um, so yeah, it's a metaphor for both Cosby's critics and the stereotypical representations of people of color that many accepted as truth, which is like, oh, if you're black, you're poor, you're a gangbanger, um, you're a broken home, like all the you're dumb, like whatever it is, whatever they were. Um, that was one of the things. So that criticism of like the Cosby Show doesn't address the concerns of the African American community, like Cosby would say, well, yeah, we do. One of the concerns of the community was settling for less um, uh, than they ever knew they were capable of. That kind of that idea. So that's what he's showing. Like, you can go to Princeton, you can, you know, but you gotta bust your ass. Like, that's, and Cosby was a quite a famous red ass about it. Like, as hip hop culture began to sort of grow through the 90s, like, he was this just sort of bitter old man about it. Like, oh, with the saggy pants and the gang banging and the sort of glorification of all this, and the the slang, like speaking, like, no, we have to speak English, and all this kind of stuff. He was publicly just like kind of a dick about it all, which brings up all these ideas of like who's this, like selling out and Uncle Tom, like all that kind of stuff that the show kind of touches on a little bit. But again, it's talking about race and class without talking about it, which is, I think, a very effective way to do it. Um, and that's the thing. Like, that was one of the criticisms. Well, he's a sellout because he has money. So in the black community, if you're successful, you're either a sellout or an Uncle Tom. Like, those kinds of dynamics definitely exist. So it's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Um, so there's, I think, who brought it up? Somebody brought up the um, shoot. Yeah. So basically, you guys who left comments pretty much hit it on the head, right? Um, Alyssa, the positive, it was supposed to be not necessarily, I mean, yeah, positive representation of African Americans, but just a different one, just like a, you know, a more aspirational one. O'Shea actually used the word aspirational. Like, that's kind of what it was. Like, let's give our community something to, an example to aspire to, right? Because where else are we getting it? You know, where else can can we get that? There weren't many places. Crystal talked about the mother's role. That's one of the things that they changed pretty quickly. Um, was how are we gonna do this show about this idea with this mother that's sort of tied to the traditional role of mother, especially on a sitcom. So they made that change. Um, Reshaping cultural perceptions. Like these are all just different ways. That's what Shay was saying. Um, Chloe shaping a black family. Um, and the whole Mallory talked about the Cliff and Theo, right, and the regular people thing. If you notice when they're doing the regular people thing, Theo's hands are like this, and this is what Cliff goes, regular people, which is they're fucked. I don't know. That's I like to think that's what he was doing on purpose. It's probably not. Um, so so TV is nothing if not copycat or reductive. So all these criticisms about the show, as popular as it was, as lucrative as it was, um, you know, as I mentioned before with in the offices thing, like eventually they run out of ideas, basically. Um, so towards the end of its run, they started they kind of caved to that criticism, and they added this character, cousin Pam, who was from the streets, and it was like how yeah, it was really these are really bad episodes. It was just last ditch, like try to keep the show on the air kind of stuff. They had actually made a bunch. They've added Raven Simone. Remember That's So Raven? Yeah, she came out. Oh my gosh, she was so annoying. But it was like classic jump the shark move. We bring out, let's bring in a new kid. Let's bring in, whatever. So this cousin Pam thing was this direct nod to those critics who said they don't address the concerns of the community. So like they take in this girl who Cliff finds on the street, and she ends up being their cousin or something. I don't. It's so bad. But that's the like, okay, we're gonna bring in this, you know, this real black character, and we're gonna assimilate her into whatever. That was the end. It was dying. But TV is reductive, right? So that idea, basically, Fresh Prince comes around. Like, let's do a show. Well, all right, let's do a different, let's do a Cosby Show ripoff. Okay, well, what would we change about it? Well, what did people not like about the Cosby Show? Well, they didn't like that they didn't address the concerns of the African American community. All right, let's do that. Let's focus on that. So you can see the progression from the Cosby Show like seamlessly into the Fresh Prince. Like the Fresh Prince, you know, was West Philadelphia born and raised. He spent most of his days on the playground, chilling out, maxing, relaxing, or cooling, shooting some b-ball outside of the school. A couple of guys were up to no good. They started making trouble in his neighborhood. I mean, he got in one little fight and his mom got scared. So she moved him with his auntie and uncle in Bel Air. Yo Holmes, smell you later. So it's almost it's a natural progression, right? to go from Cosby to Fresh Prince. It's just like, look at it. Like, it's they to focus more blatantly on the class thing. Like, that's what, who wrote that? Who wrote Nuanced? um, Charlie meant that Fresh Prince was a more nuanced look at this. Disagree. Maybe nuance is just the wrong word, but it's not nuanced at all. It's just like punch you in the face about class, right? And I thought Cosby did it in a more nuanced way, so nuanced that a lot of people didn't even realize it was what was happening with the show, because they're dumb. But they certainly ramped up the class clash in Fresh Prince, right? So they took Will, so the main character, Will, is literally West Philadelphia. I don't know if it was the ghetto, but you know, lower middle class, if not lower class. And he moves to Bel Air, which is like Huxtable's on shrooms, right? Just like out of the, mansion, butler, pool, tennis courts, all this stuff, the club, the private school, like, all that shit. So they focused on almost exclusively the class issue and how is this going to work? Like, how are they going to even, relate to each other? So that, I think, is an interesting, like, you just see people creating Fresh Prince and be like, they see Cosby sort of dying and the whole Cousin Pam thing, and they're like, let's do that, but let's make, the Cousin Pam character this, this big, this like funny, athletic, big, handsome, whatever kid from the streets, and let's make the Cosbys into this sort of let's really exaggerate those spectrum ends, I guess. So the Fresh Prince was kind of, if you watch this episode, or any episode really, it was this kind of holdover from the safe, sort of infantilized version of urban youth in the 80s. Like, if you look at hip hop culture, right, it started in the late 70s with like Grandmaster Flash and Africa Bambaataa and Houdini, these kind of groups that were all like sort of socially conscious. Like, a lot of the music was about getting out of the ghetto and trying to, again, like, change their lives, right? Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head, like that kind of stuff. And the 80s sort of co-opted that, of course, and made it into this bubblegum breakdancing to save the rec center kind of thing. Sort of appropriated by white culture too, to some extent. Like the Breakin' movies. I don't know if you guys seen Breakin' and Breakin' 2, but it's all about just like, dance battles and like Rodney Dangerfield rapping or whatever. Well, then the 90s was this sort of backswing to, if you've seen Straight Outta Compton. Wait, what's the NWA movie? Anyway, it was about fuck the police. It was about activism. It was about angry black culture sort of reacting to this type of stuff. And then, in the 2000s, it was like, I don't know, megalomania, basically. It's like Money Cash Hose became, so this pendulum swing back, Money Cash Hose, and then the swing back to like, just like Kanye, basically. megalomaniac. Um, so Will is kind of this character that's like doesn't fit in anywhere. Like, why is he wearing all neon? He's got the camera around his, like, strapped to him. That was weird. And he seems like kind of like mentally challenged a little bit. Like, you're just so loud and obnoxious. Um, that's because, like, they couldn't, America wasn't ready for, right? If he's from the streets, like, the streets must be pretty good if he's from the streets. I'm saying they couldn't have Tupac walk in the door um, on the show. They had to sort of, again, kind of infantilize him a little bit. Um, and yeah, I mean, and if you watch the opening credits, the one little fight he got in was like they spun him around a little bit. It wasn't like a gunfight or anything. Um, anyway, yeah. So it kind of has this weird place in this hip hop um, culture that it kind of aligns itself with Will. Um, but at the core of it, Fresh Prince is a logical progression of ideas put forth by the Cosby Show for their respective decades, right? So Will is very much 90s, and the Cosbys were very much 80s. So you can see those kinds of changes happening too. Why Will is acting like he's on ecstasy the whole episode, I don't know. That was, again, had to make it um, somehow palatable, right? They had to make this street kid somehow palatable to an audience, I guess. But yeah, the biggest thing, and I'm surprised none of you mentioned it in your comments, but one of the most important characters in the history of television is Carlton Banks. And I know he's kind of this butt of the joke with the Carlton dance and like all that kind of stuff. But he is one of the most important characters in the history of television. Why? Because the criticism, again, another criticism of the Cosby Show, you can't just make a black person white. You can't make a black family white. And, Fresh Prince literally says, "Hold my beer," because here's Carlton. And the he's he is such a mind fuck because you look at him, he's clearly black, but everything he does is white, right? Playing tennis and into politics and like all these kinds of things. He calls into question the very idea of stereotypes, right? And that he's revolutionary because he's breaking all of these stereotypes down. The implication that if you're black, you can't be into tennis or politics or sweater vests, I don't know, whatever, or a nerd or whatever it is out the window because here it's literally happening, right? So Carlton is this sort of, I think, a direct connection to the Cosby Show, and just like kind of a fuck you to anyone who was ever like, oh, yeah, the Cosby Show's a great show, but it could never be a thing, right? You can't just make a black family white. They took this character of Carlton and made him Carlton for that express purpose, right? If they're addressing the concerns, like that was one of their concerns, was like that you think only black people can only be you know, 5 things or whatever it is. Um, so he's easily one of the most important characters in TV history, and everyone just he's kind of a joke to people because they don't really, they don't they see the humor in it. Yes, it's supposed to be funny, um, and that's kind of what um, yeah, the Chloe mentioned that, and that's the thing about all of this stuff. Maybe I mentioned it in my intro video. The emphasis, making these things easier to digest, right? Like that's what comedy can do. It can bring this stuff to you in a much more accessible, digestible way, and hopefully we are equipped to make sense of it um, on our own. And that's kind of something that not just Fresh Prince or Cosby, like all these shows are meant to do. And again, that puts TV into this class of like, well, it's not the idiot box or it's not the boob tube or whatever boomers love to call it. It's more than it can be more. It can be more than that. So you have the Fresh Prince um, dynamics, the big ones between Uncle Phil and Will, right? The beef they have at the end, you know, Uncle Phil's like clutching his pearls, like, oh my God, this kid's everything that's wrong with our culture and all that stuff. And Will thinks that he's everything that's wrong with the culture. Turned his back on the culture. Sellout, Uncle Tom, like all that stuff kind of comes up. And then, they kind of realize that they're both cut from similar cloth, right? Uncle Phil says, "Listen, I read every word Malcolm X said. Um, Malcolm X wrote. I saw him speak. Like I was poor growing up. I had to bust my ass. I had to Cosby this or Huxtable this situation. So there's part of that. There's a Cliff Theo thing going on there, but it's ramped up way more. Um, and then Will's like, no, in that process, you forgot who you were, where you came from, all that kind of stuff. So they're both kind of like, there has to be a middle ground here. Like, that's the takeaway. It's like, yeah, Will was a fucking moron. Like, he needs to be a little bit more responsible or, um, just normal, I guess. And Phil is a little too stiff, and he needs, to remember what's like to have fun and make jokes and things like that. Like, they need to be somewhere in between, right? And then, you know, Phil thinks he has Will figured out, and then he plays like he plays like a 30-second section of a Beethoven symphony or something. And I was like, oh wow, maybe I got it wrong. It's so dumb. But that's what's happening there. So the changes between Cosby and Fresh Prince are they really ramped up the class. In fact, the class issue. Charlie talking about more nuance, I think way less nuance, more in your face, more, hey, this is what the show's about, right? And sort of going about it that way. Yeah, and Uncle Phil is basically Cliff Huxtable on steroids, right? Exaggeration to the point of realization is that I said that in some videos before. Like, this is an exaggerated version of the Cosby Show, like extremely exaggerated version. So what are they trying to say? They're trying to talk about the whole black white, upper class, lower class, all that kind of stuff. there's this idea also in margin a lot of marginalized communities. Doesn't happen in the white community for that I know of. This idea that you can't you're not white enough. I've never heard that, but I have heard you're not black enough, you're not Asian enough, you're not gay enough, whatever it is. Like there's this constant um, measuring of your ethnicity or sexuality or whatever from the outside looking in for the most part. Um, and that's something that it's got to suck to deal with. Um, or even, yeah, if you're not playing into your stereotype enough, people look at you funny. So how much of yourself do you have to give up every day just to get by and survive, right? Um, I can't even like conceive of the kind of stress or agony that would inflict on somebody who couldn't just be who they are because of society or stereotypes or being judged or whatever. Um, so the whole Uncle Tom sellout thing is like, how black am I supposed to be here? Right? Like, it's so fundamentally fucked up. But it's not that Fresh Prince isn't black enough, right? You kind of we're trying to prove that that concept is flawed. Like I think Cosby and the Fresh Prince sort of tear down that idea that you have to be a certain level of blackness, or that blackness is a finite thing, right? So like Carlton's not black enough, but that that doesn't make any sense. Like, or even the Cosby family's not black enough because why? Because they're educated, and they have good jobs. Like that doesn't make that's like super racist to say. So it's yeah, it's more funny to me that Will is what white America thought about black people in the 90s, right? Say like let's keep him at arm's length, right? He's digestible enough, he's safe enough, but he's not really edgy, but it's safe, the safe sort of version, like everything's okay. Will. Um, it's also, yeah, I'm just going through my notes a little bit. What happens when we think we know people based on stereotypes, prejudices? It's really rarely works out for the best. Um, and this idea that they both have, Will and Phil, that the other side is ruining it for the rest of them, right? Because like Will's like, no, you're the problem, and Uncle Phil's like, no, you're the problem. Well, what? The problem isn't. Maybe that's the case. Is the problem is saying that someone else is the problem. If that makes any sense. Um, I don't know if it does or not. So I know this is a long video, but it's two shows. It's two shows in one. Chloe, I mentioned, she brought up the sort of increased emphasis on class in the Fresh Prince, right? Um, and the easier to digest idea about just humor in general, like can provides more access to ideas and cultures and perspectives that you probably otherwise wouldn't engage, which is a good thing. Charlie and the more nuanced thing, again, I think it's way less nuanced. Um, but he also talked about the 90s being more, that's sort of in line with my whole hip hop uh, my hip hop timeline thing, right? The 90s was more sort of leaning into activism and social change and things like that, like from the 80s for sure. And like that's the whole NWA era where it's like, no, wait, shit's still fucked up. Like, civil rights movement was awesome, but we still got a long way to go. So this was network TV, NBC's way of kind of, you know, dipping its toe into that whole conversation. Um, so that's my Cosby Fresh Prince video. If you got this far, leave a comment on the video and be like, I, yay. Otherwise, I'll see you guys soon.